Welcome back to Gloved Up Garage. I got a bunch of parts in for the Marauder. We got the upper control arms for the front, we got the front and rear brake pads, and we got the flexible TCE brake hoses. So in this episode, I'll be working on the brakes and the suspension, getting this car ready for the road once again. I got the rotors turned at my local O'Reilly's, and they did an awesome job. In fact, these are the rear rotors, and they look amazing. I'm going to go through and paint the centers black with just some caliper paint. Make them look a little better because they do kind of get rusty and nasty looking. I'll just get them set out here on my trailer because I don't really care if I get overspray on it. You'll notice the rotor on the right is brand new. After they turned one of the front rotors, it didn't quite smooth out as well as I had hoped it would. So they did an awesome thing, and they warranted me a brand new rotor, which was a cost of over $100 for a new rotor for the front. And you can tell it's got a coating on it already, so that's kind of the standard thing when you get nicer rotors these days. They have the coating, like that spray paint stuff that's on there. I'm going to go through and I'm going to do these in black because we're going to do the calipers on the Marauder in black as well with the brackets and all that stuff, make it all look really good. So I'm going to hit these with some spray paint. I've wiped them down with some brake clean just to get any grease, anti-seize, dirt, stuff like that off of them. We'll hit these with just that black paint, and we'll come back. So I've got like 3 heavy coats of black caliper paint on these rotors, and they should be really good. You can tell that I went ahead and covered pretty much everything. I'm going to go through with some 320, maybe some 150 grit sandpaper, and just clean off the area around the outside of the rotor where the pad actually contacts it. So the pads we're going to use on this car are Hawk HPS's. I believe they're a ceramic pad if I remember right, and I don't want to have anything get in the way of those pads bedding to these rotors. There's actually a process, and we'll go through that a little later. You put the pads on, you get it up to speed, you hit the brakes, you do some smaller speed braking, and it will bed those pads to these rotors and basically get them nice and smooth and nice and clean as well, so they have a lot of bite. So we'll get to that a little later once the pads arrive. For now, I just want to get these rotors cleaned up so that I can put them back on the car. And then from there, once the calipers are cleaned up as well, along with the caliper brackets, we're going to go through and paint them to match the rotors. And that will pretty much wrap up the brakes, other than the flexible lines that we've got to go on. And I'll do the flexible lines first before I really do anything else, because I'm going to get brake fluid everywhere. I don't want to get brake fluid on my nice new caliper paint. So we'll do those before we really dive too far into this. So what we've got for the flexible hoses that are normally rubber on these cars are these braided hoses with like Teflon centers. They're made by this company, TC Performance. And there are some upgrades out there for the stock brakes on these cars. And I have done it on a previous car. We elected not to do it on this one just to make it more stock appearing. The instruction sheet, you can see it says stock front, Zac front, and then the rear. So the Zac front, what this is, there's a gentleman called Gerald Irwin. He's out of Michigan. And he makes some billet aluminum brackets that will allow you to adapt a C5 Corvette front brake caliper to the hub on a Crown Vic and a Marauder, your spindle. With that, you get increased diameter of the rotor, and you run, I believe it's 2010 to 2014 GT500 Mustang, Shelby Mustang front rotors. So those are like a 13 or 14 inch rotor. With his bracket, you can put the dual piston PBR caliper on it, which the stock calipers for the Marauder and the Crown Vics, I mean, they are a dual piston. They're very heavy design. I'm not sure who makes them, but the PBR calipers are much better, much more high performance oriented than the stock sedan calipers. So what we have is just the stock kit, because again, we're not going to upgrade the brakes on this other than just these hoses and the pads. These are the rear hoses. They are longer than the front ones, and you can tell they do everything. They include the brackets, your new banjo bolts. They have the copper washers in here. I mean, they include everything in this kit to make this as painless as possible. It's a very simple process of just unbolting the stock lines that are on these cars and then bolting in those braided lines. And you can see that's the stock brake line right there. It runs up to the frame. There's a mounting bracket, which they include a new mounting bracket. And then that's where the hard line meets the soft line. Undo all this, put your new stuff on, and then you just bleed your brakes one by one. And then it wouldn't hurt to do an ABS bleed on this. I know I've talked about that in some previous videos, especially with my Marauder. I had to do several ABS bleeds after I replaced the master cylinder and the brake booster. And we'll do that on this car just because it's been sitting. We look at the brake fluid. It does look a little dark. So we're gonna go ahead and flush the system while we got it all apart, just to make sure that this is good and ready for any high performance braking that he may do. Just got one of the rear rotors done, and I had to put it up here to see what it looked like, and wow, it really looks good. I'll probably go ahead and black out the center of the axle too, just spray a little bit of that same caliper paint in there. The line here at the top is a little rough. I didn't want to get too aggressive because there is a little bit of a lip right there. The pad will set down there and take care of the edge and actually straighten out that paint line a little bit. But I got a majority of the paint off. It's nice and flat and smooth. That's what we're looking for. So from here, we'll let the pads do the rest of it. That little bit of paint's not going to be too big of a deal, but I will tell you, while I was cleaning the paint off of these things, I clogged up my sandpaper really quick. So I'm glad I took the time to use sandpaper instead of letting the pad do it, because it'll clog up the lines in the pad and it could cause issues with that bedding process. I had to turn the heat on. It was just too cold in here. To replace these rubber lines, the first thing you want to do is break it loose from the caliper. You are going to need to bleed the brake system, of course, because you're opening up the hydraulic system. I've gone ahead and loosened this. It's dripping a little bit of fluid, which is fine. And then the next thing I've done is loosen this nut. This is a 13 millimeter and then a 14 on the back of the caliper. The next thing I'll do is take this bolt out and go ahead and loosen this nut from the rubber line itself. Then we'll get the braided line put up into position. They include a new bracket that bolts up there to the frame. And they don't really say in the instructions, but they are side specific. What you want to look at is the orientation of the tab on this bracket that holds the line. You want it to be very close to that nut that is on the end of the brake line, the hard line coming from the body to the rubber line, and what will soon be a braided line. So make sure you get that orientated correct, because they are side specific. So I'll get that loose. We'll move on to the next step. Now we got the line, the hose mounted to the hard line. This is tightened up, and I've got my little clip in there to hold this line. It will move around, which is fine. This is not coming loose. Last thing I'll do is tighten this up to the frame. Right now I've still got it kind of loose. I'll put a final torque on it once I get the orientation of this hose correct. And then from there, I will go through and tighten everything up to the final torque specs. Now, you can see there's already fluid running through the hose, which is good. We kind of want to gravity bleed the system as much as we can. That's going to keep a lot of the fluid in the air moving through the system. No problem there. I'll go ahead and move the caliper back over here to the bracket. That way I can make sure that I get the hose routed correctly into the back of the caliper. I've already got the old hose off. Of course, it's leaking fluid everywhere. I'll go through and spray all this off with brake clean when I'm done to get this, get the old fluid off and to keep it from stripping the paint on the suspension parts. The flex line bolted to the caliper now, and we're good to go. One thing I didn't mention, there's a copper washer that goes between the caliper and the line, between the line and the bolt, or the banjo bolt that holds that on. That bolt's actually hollow. It's got a hole in it, and the fluid comes in through, obviously through the line. It hits this chamber, goes through the bolt itself and into the caliper. So the next thing I'll need to do is pop that bleeder off once the caliper is painted, and we get new pads on, paint the bracket. Then we'll bleed the brakes back here on this side. We'll go around and bleed all the brakes on the car, just to get any air that may be in this line or in the caliper out. I did dump the fluid out of the caliper while I was working on it, mainly just to try to keep the mess to a minimum. It's going to pour fluid out all over everything. I've got these nicely painted rotors. I would like to try to keep them as clean as I possibly can. So I didn't want brake fluid leaking all over the rotors, lifting the paint off. So I've got all that cleaned up, sprayed everything down with brake cleaner, and we'll move on to the next side. Went ahead and finished up this driver's rear brakes. Got the new pads on, got everything kind of lined up. I don't have everything tightened down just yet. My plan now is to go ahead and clean the caliper off, touch up the rotor a little bit. I'm gonna have to put a little bit more paint. I did chip it in a couple of spots, but I'll tape everything off that I don't want painted and mask everything off, of course, the new line. And then we'll clean this caliper really good. We'll hit it with some caliper paint just to make it match everything and look really good. This stuff, if you put it on right, it will stick for quite a bit of time. Cool thing about it, you can find it at any O'Reilly. So if you ever need to touch it up, O'Reilly's, AutoZone, they all carry this Duplicolor caliper paint. We're just going to use gloss black. So I will clean all this really good with some brake cleaner, scrub it with a brush, hit it with another thing of brake clean, and then we'll shoot some paint on it. Of course, I'll turn the heater off before I start any kind of painting process, but a little bit of brake clean I'm using over here. I'm pretty far away from the heater. Shouldn't impact anything, but I'll go ahead and shut that off when I clean it as well. I've got the rear brakes all wrapped up. The rotor and the caliper look really good. I'm very happy with the way that turned out, especially with the braided line back there. I still need to work on the routing of it. I haven't bolted the caliper down. I've just got the bolts kind of loose in place. I've got to set the wheel up there just to make sure that that line is going to clear. That's one thing when you're putting these flexible lines on. You have to make sure that you get it clocked correctly, basically, so that the wheel will not rub on the line. I started working on the front suspension. I've got the ABS wire unclipped from the upper control arm. I've got my sway bar end link loose from the spindle. That has to come out. You can see it's right there, and it's right underneath the ball joint nut. So I've got to get that loose in order to break those two apart. And what I thought I was going to be able to do is just slide those bolts out. You see I've got that front one loose, and it's pushed back up against the strut. I thought I was going to be able to loosen that and just slide it out. I'm going to have to pull the strut and the spring assembly to get it out. There's just not enough room behind it to clear the strut and the spring. So that's going to have to come apart. That's pretty simple. You just take that bolt loose there. There's 3 bolts at the top of this aluminum subframe at the very top on the other side of that shield. And then the strut assembly will just come out of there, basically. It's not too hard to take out. Starting to get this upper control arm off, I went ahead and took the sway bar link out, and it just screws into the top of the spindle. Bottom of the sway bar just got some studs that stick out. One thing I ran into, so I put an impact on this bolt. This is the spindle, upper control arm. That's the ball joint that's bad. I put a 24 millimeter or 21 millimeter socket on this, hit it with the impact, and it just spun. So in order to break this loose, what I have to do, I've got my ratchet here, 6 millimeter Allen socket, and then the closest thing I could find was a 13/16 open-ended wrench, because I don't have a 21 millimeter. This is close enough. So I've got the wrench on the nut, I've got the Allen socket into the end of the ball joint, and I've actually got the ratchet set to tighten while I hold that wrench in place. And basically what it does is it forces the ball joint upward while holding the nut. Otherwise, that ball joint will just continue to spin as you hit it with the impact. So I'll come back once I get this all broken loose. And the upper control arm is now out. I had to loosen the strut to get this out because the machined area is in here that you can see right there, right there. That's where this upper control arm bolts through the sides. There's no way to access that bolt, so this had to come loose. Of course, I have to take the control arm off because I'm going to replace it. And this ball joint, I'm having to use a pretty decent amount of force to get this to rotate, and it's kind of notchy. So this was going to fail in the future. With this boot deteriorated, the grease leaking out, it's only a matter of time before this got really bad. And if this breaks, this is your upper mount to your suspension, so it causes a safety issue. The front of the car comes down. If you're doing this while you're steering or something, you could easily lose control. So we're going to replace this with a new one. And again, the new one has new bushings where it mounts up there to the subframe. These are not terrible, but you can see there's some cracking in it. Again, it's going to cause a handling issue. We're going to go with a new part. and I will come back once I've got that in there. This is the new control arm for the passenger side. This is a Moog or Moog, however you say it, upper control arm. I noticed this is stamped, which concerned me at first until I flipped it over and I saw that there's a brace welded on the inside. This is going to be just as strong, if not stronger, than that cast piece that I just took out. The cool thing about this one, the upper ball joint is serviceable. You just take that spring lock clip off and then you can change the ball joint out. We've got new bushings on there, of course, because it's a new part. This is severe duty rated according to Moog. This is what they recommended for the police interceptors. So for this Marauder, it's going to be just fine. We've got a little bit of hardware that comes with it too. We got the new nuts that go on the bolts that hold the control arm to the subframe. We got a new nut for the ball joint. There's also a grease fitting because this is a greasable ball joint, so you want to replace that grease fitting and pack it up with some new grease. Something else that I didn't look at first, inside of this bag there are some plastic clips. You can see one right there. There's another one. Those plastic clips are for the ABS sensor because that sensor attaches to the upper control arm. I literally spent about a half an hour taking these clips loose so that I wouldn't break these, because I didn't think that there would be new ones in the package with the control arm. But now I know for the other side that I can just break those clips off and get this sensor out of the way to get to the upper control arm. So I'll go ahead and start the process of putting this thing back together, and I'll come back in just a little bit. The new upper control arm is in place. I do not have the final torque on it yet. I want the weight of the vehicle on the suspension when I go through and do the final torque on these upper control arm bolts and the upper ball joint to the spindle. From here, I'll move on to the braking system. I need to clean up the bracket for the caliper and get some paint on it. And then I will move on to painting the caliper and replacing this flexible hose that goes right here with the braided hose like I did on the rear. This bracket gets changed as well. So I'll work on getting all this cleaned up and I'll come back as soon as I've got this done. This right front corner is all wrapped up. New control arm, new brake pads, new rotor. I've got the new flexible braided brake line on there. We're pretty much wrapped up on this side. The only thing left to do is go through and bleed the brake system, which I'll worry about that at a later time. I've got to still obviously do all this stuff to the driver's side, but to save this video from being absolutely too long, I'll handle the driver's side off camera. It's going to be essentially the same thing as I did over here on the passenger side. I've got everything laid out over here on the driver's side. I'll handle that off camera. I just want to take an opportunity to thank each and every one of you for watching these videos. Thank you for the subscribes. Thank you for the comments and the likes. It really means a lot to me. It's very flattering to know that 330 people subscribe to the channel at this moment and see some of the junk that I work on here. This car is definitely not junk, but I still have a very long list of things to tackle before it's ready for the road again. Be sure to hit the bell icon to be notified when I upload a new video so you can see the progress on this car. With brakes and suspension crossed off this long list, I still have a lot of stuff to do. In the next episode, I'll be changing the spark plugs, changing the oil in the supercharger, changing the oil in the filter in the engine. So, until then, remember to stay gloved up.